The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you so much to our listeners for joining us again for another episode of Voices in Validation. This is a very special episode as it is the third in our three-part series as we talk about how to get your medical device to market in 10 easy steps. And for that, we welcome back Roberta Good.
Hi, it's great to be back.
Well, thanks, Roberta. I appreciate all the time you've spent with us over these last 3 weeks talking about how to get your medical device to commercialization, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the third and final episode in this series. And we spent a lot of time discussing design verification and validation in the last episode. We highlighted why V&V are among the most important aspects of the design and development process for medical devices. And this week, we'll hear more about that, as well as so many more steps in the final preparation for launch of our product and marketing. Mm-hmm. So, Roberta, perhaps you could briefly outline the steps that are associated with this final phase prior to product launch.
Sure, be happy to. So what's remaining is two things. First, releasing the product either into limited test markets or into clinical trial sites if required, but many medical devices won't require clinicals, as we discussed previously. And the final step would be launching the full product, launch of the full product commercialization, everything out the door, signed, sealed, delivered, and initiating. It doesn't stop there. We need to, it's a very important next step. After final launch, we need to initiate post-market surveillance.
Excellent. And I'm sure our listeners have been waiting for this episode. This is really tying together all of the elements that we've discussed in the first two episodes, as well as those that we're going to talk about today. And I know we just mentioned in the intro that we're still thinking of verification and validation. Why should we still be thinking of V&V now as we move into product launch preparation? And how should we be carrying evidence of testing? We talked about the testing involved in this into this phase.
Well, verification and validation, they really have a specific point in the design and development process where they're, I guess, primarily the focus of our activities. But they don't end, because as we think about releasing product to the field and looking at actual field-based performance in real people, even if we did clinical trials before, now we're going to have a much larger patient population and, subtle issues, opportunities for improvement can emerge that weren't obvious in a smaller sample size of the population. So as we have an eye towards post-market surveillance and continuous improvement, especially along the safety profile of our products, we need to be mindful of just what the limitations were and are of our previous studies, and we should be more than willing to revise our previous benchtop data in verification and validation with this larger patient population of true clinical data if need be.
So just because we've done some testing doesn't mean we stop there. We have to continue watching, right, the data, accumulating notes, from feedback and trials of every kind. And then obviously once you launch it, I'm sure there's still feedback that's coming as users are, getting acquainted with the product.
Yes.
So, it makes sense that this phase just doesn't stop. There's no end to it. It's a cycle, right?
It is.
Is this the right time? So as we prepare product launch and move away from the development, I mean, we're still in development, but we're moving much closer to the launch. Is this the right time, or when is the right time, I guess, to start thinking about marketing and branding? And what cautions would you provide to listeners regarding promotion?
Well, so it's a great question, and there certainly are some guidelines rather that I'd like to provide regarding promotion. Specifically, we know that we cannot make claims that are outside of those that were approved by the FDA in our initial regulatory submission, whether that was a 510K or a PMA, as we discussed in part one of this series. So to make claims beyond those, essentially that constitutes misbranding and mislabeling, misbranding, same thing, and can result in serious consequences from a regulatory governmental perspective, consequences to our product, and beyond. So I think it's important to be aware that claims come in many forms. It's not just what's on our label, it's what our sales reps are saying. At the customer site, we are responsible to ensure that those are within scope as well, which is a training issue. We have to make sure that our sales reps are well aware, they're trained of the FDA requirements and other regulatory requirements for that market, and that they're well aware of what is legal to claim and what is not. Additionally, we should be very mindful of other promotional materials that may not be firsthand. Maybe we have an intern working with us in the summer, and he publishes a paper, and there's a poster session at the Society for Women Engineers, and so on. So we really need to be aware of all types of claims. They come in many forms, both formal and informal. And the devil's in the details with those informal claims. That's really where people, I think, often don't expect there to be a lot of gravity for a misstep, especially if it's unintentional, but indeed there is.
So just in follow-up to that, Roberta, how can you avoid some of that from happening? I mean, do you have to train and thoroughly train your salespeople and anyone coming through the doors, essentially, on product? I don't want to just say product specifications, but really on how to represent, I guess, the product.
Absolutely. Stacey, you couldn't be more right. It really comes down to training, and not just once, but reinforcement of the basic training, I think, is essential. And indeed, it fits really well with another element that fits perfectly with post-market surveillance, customer complaints. And that is this: not only do we need to train our representatives of our company to be mindful of statements they may make regarding claims for the product, but also to be aware of what a customer complaint about our product looks like and sounds like. So to build on this idea of informality and its trappings, a customer complaint can be as informal as being at the line in the grocery store and you hear somebody say, yeah, I used so-and-so's product last week, and I've had nothing but headaches ever since that time, or what have you. That indeed qualifies as a customer complaint, and it is reportable under the regulatory guidelines.
And so I can imagine this could be a huge issue if it's not, well maintained because of the internet. I mean, the social media. I'm just thinking of all the places these informal complaints or comments could pop up. And so as a medical device manufacturer, then you really need to play watchdog too, to make sure that, but I know we're going to get to that, but I'm just now running through my head. And so it just goes to prove how essential it is to plan for good marketing and promotion, just like you've planned for every other step in this process. Yes?
Absolutely, because this is where, at the end of all that investment in time and energy and resources, it can kind of fall apart on us if we don't finish by ensuring a robust training program for our representatives, both in customer support and in sales.
Of course, of course. Thank that. That's wow. I hadn't thought of it in all of those from all of those sides before. So, so good points for listeners to take into consideration. Talking a little bit about limited test markets. So when you're releasing your product into a limited test market, or into a clinical trial site, if that's where you're going with your product, what data are you hoping to achieve? Does this include stability testing, shipping trials? Talk a little bit about that whole process.
Sure. Well, when we find ourselves ready for this very, very important stage that often I like to call it first human use,
right?
Because it doesn't have to be at product launch that we have the first human use.
True.
Right? It can be part of a limited release or clinical study, as you said. So when we're looking at first human use, we have a moral, an ethical, a legal, a scientific, every kind of responsibility a human can think of, in my mind, to ensure that the product has been fully vetted to the extent possible. Again, before there's any in vivo, any life testing. So.
Right.
In this case, as we look towards, I think you made mention just now, I think of a limited test market, for example, before we would have any human use, we would ensure that the product has already been through the complete design verification process, which again is testing to show that the product meets the specification with objective evidence, and I mean with appropriate sample sizes. In the old days, when I started in this field 30 years ago, I can't tell you how many times we used a sample size of 5. It's embarrassing, but that's what people did back then. We just didn't have the awareness. And of course, in 1996-97, when the QSR was revised and added subpart O statistical techniques, we all started to apply those more robustly. But in any case, we need to ensure that we have fully verified the product, that it has been sterilized, that the sterilization process has been fully validated, that we have demonstrated that the packaging, if it's a sterile barrier package, can maintain that barrier to the point of care, regardless of the supply chain, the logistics involved, or label it that it can't tolerate a particular mode of transport. We need to even look out for rogue players. Like a quick anecdote, years ago, I was working on a product development, as a product development engineer, and we had everything buttoned up and aligned, and it all looked great. And it went out for a limited test market. And what happened was one of our rogue sales representatives was going to deliver the product to the hospital that morning. He left it overnight in the trunk of his car in the dead of winter in Minnesota. And the next day, got to the hospital, thawed it out, and used it. But that freeze-thaw cycle had damaged the product. So it was no longer safe for human use. It's just an example of the caution we need to take. It doesn't end with the testing. It has to go all the way through the chain, the supply chain, to the point of care.
Yes, so important. And we see that. I mean, obviously, that's a great example. Your sales rep, a great example of medical devices. But we hear this in the life science industry, in the pharmaceuticals, especially with, home delivery of pharmaceuticals and devices. Yeah. And it's hard to account for all of the extremes in temperatures and the other elements, wind and rain and all of these things. And maybe it gets left out there for 2 days or 3 days on the doorstep or, whatever. I mean, I think this is so important that we're considering all of this in this final phase before really doing a full launch of the product, right? So we still have a little bit of time to fix any minor things or change up our packaging or our method of delivery, perhaps.
Well, if I may interject, Stacey, you're absolutely right on, but I want to be clear for our listeners that we should already have robust statistical, scientific evidence, objective evidence that the packaging can withstand extremes in temperature, humidity, and so on, as required by our standards, our ASTM 4169D, for example, as well as, and maintain that sterile barrier the entire time. All of these things should be, is to the full extent that we are capable, should be nailed down for the first human use. However, we'll always be looking for additional evidence, opportunities to improve. No product is 100%
right.
Impervious to any kind of, any kind of anything. And the standards don't check. The standards only check what they check. Even the challenge conditions are not completely are completely inclusive of extremes. So yes, you're right. We may have to circle back and look for opportunities to make it even better.
Okay. But likely that's not going to happen. We're just going to continue to support our evidence that we've already gathered, that we've done our due diligence and ensured that it's, great packaging, shipping. We've considered all of that. So excellent. So now we've gathered even more data with our limited test market or clinical trial, and we're moving closer to a full product launch. And but prior to that, it's necessary to complete some technical documentation. I think that we talked about documentation in the development, in the planning, and the development phase, and now we need to talk about documentation again. How thorough should your documents be at this time? Inclusive of regulatory release, audit ready documents, all of that kind of stuff. Where should we be with documentation at this point?
Well, as you might have guessed, and I believe you're being tongue in cheek, because we know, I think it makes common sense. Our documents must be airtight at this point. We are not going forward. In fact, before first human use, we typically have everything nailed down. But I would say for sure, by full product release, we are going to have the design history file, which, remember, is documents the evolution of the design, done. We're going to have, done-ish, because it lives on actually with any additional iterations to design and manufacturing based on our post-market feedback. But to this point, it should all be current. We'll have our device master record or recipe for making product nailed down. We'll have the device history record. If this first batch that goes to human use absolutely will have to be made or should be made on production equipment using production operators. That's part of design validation, in fact, is to ensure that the normal, quote unquote, manufacturing process will be represented and tested in this validation step. So all of that should be nailed down too. Not to mention, as you mentioned, the regulatory filings, of course. Intellectual property filings should have long ago been completed. We'll have all of our specifications, prints, everything. Everything will be ready and audit ready at that.
Okay, that's where I was getting. So really, you should have a very complete file minus any post-market findings. And
certainly.
Thank you. And so I'm just being mindful of all that needs to happen before we actually launch the product. And documentation is just one piece of it. So, now it's really time to get all our ducks in a row, so to speak, right? So help us if you can. We'll just pause here for a moment for listeners, for you to kind of recount all of the steps that we've talked about at this point that's needed to fully launch this product, so that we know we are set to move on to this final phase.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So in my mind, best practices is that it starts with an investigation by the engineer or the engineering team of an unmet need in the market, preferably via direct clinical experience or a relationship with a clinician. So we find out there's an unmet need, and then as engineers, the design engineers will go back to the ranch and figure a creative solution to fill that niche, that need, which results in usually in several different prototypes, which would then be reviewed by the clinician to make sure we're on the right path. This is all part of assessing the commercial feasibility of the product, part of our market evaluation. Once we have an idea where we're going to head, how we're going to meet that unmet need, we'll be able to evaluate our regulatory strategy and know what path we're taking. This also, of course, is dependent upon which countries, regions, markets we plan to launch the product in, and even to evolve in. As I mentioned a few times, it's often much more efficient and cost effective to consider all potential markets at once so that you're not forced to repeat expensive, arduous testing in the future. So the regulatory path will be dependent upon that. Then, of course, our intellectual property, we need to create barriers to the competition by filing timely provisional patent applications or full utility patent applications, depending on the circumstances, and ensuring that we've addressed any issues regarding claims from the prior to the prior art. Addressing any concerns about our competitors and the prior art, as I said. So looking at that intellectual property protection, and that's not just in the US, but also internationally, if in fact that's something that we believe we can afford at this point and that is relevant at this point. Sure. So on an individual basis. Then we'll, of course, look at our quality system requirements, 21 CFR 820, the QSR in the US, ISO 13485 in the European Union and most of the rest of the world, and additional requirements, regulatory non-quality system requirements, such as the ISO 14971 risk management standard, biocompatibility standards, and others. Next, we'll demonstrate technical feasibility. Then we'll build a business case and obtain funding from our brother-in-law, our venture capitalist, our local bank, our angel investors, and so on.
Right.
Easier said than done. Conduct iterative product design. We'll look at design for Six Sigma, design for manufacturing and assembly as part of our design. The protocols, we will then submit our final patent and regulatory files once we have frozen or decided upon a final design. Then really throughout, but particularly at this phase, if we haven't done so earlier, we'll be evaluating and building our risk management file. We definitely have to have that in order to freeze our design. And certainly it's a tool, it's a very useful tool for refining our design and ensuring that we have designed out any unacceptable risk, which is part of a whole nother series of discussions beyond the scope of what we can cover today, but quite important. As we move forward, we'll perform design verification and validation testing on the product, the packaging, and we will be looking towards the labeling, really looking at the label claims as well for the shelf life, completing our process development and validation next, which includes our manufacturing processes, IQ, OQ, PQ, and our sterilization and packaging processes. Then our release of the product into a limited test market or clinical trial sites if required, otherwise going directly into full commercialization and initiating that post-market surveillance portion of our work. And of course, I have to add, the feedback must be in place. The systems, not just the intent, but the systems must be in place to gather that post-market data and feed it back into the design and development process, into the risk management process as well.
Wow. So we've covered a lot.
Yes.
So we have covered a lot. And now we're ready to move into the final steps. And you just touched on a point that I was going to ask a question about. So that's perfect segue, which is the post-market surveillance. And I was hoping you could describe to our listeners a little bit more about what that entails and how long it generally takes to complete those tasks?
Sure. Wow. How long it
It's a
takes
big
to
thing.
complete.
I know.
It's a kind of a never ending, as long as the product's on the market. Well, there's been a new concept that's come to the fore as we looked at the convergence and revision of those standards that we talked about in part one of the series, the quality management system, risk management system,
Right,
and the medical device regulation, to look at a product throughout its entire life cycle. And that is from the beginning of the concept in the early design phase, all the way through decommissioning at the end of its life in the market. And that includes the residual shelf life. After you stop selling a product, if there's remaining product with residual shelf life, that is part of the life cycle for which we're responsible too. So we really need to look at gathering data from our post-market surveillance activities throughout the entire life cycle of the product and being responsive to it. It used to be that companies would gather this data and make really nice Pareto charts and look at it, periodically at a management review session, and there'd be CAPAs that would, corrective and preventive actions that would come up from time to time. That's not enough. We need to be active and proactive and reactive and show that we are actually putting that information back into the risk management file and into the plan and into the assumptions we made, and if need be, taking additional mitigation actions to protect the customer base, as well as to ensure that our product, even including redesign in some cases, even including refiling of regulatory submissions, believe it or not, because if we modify our design, if the form, fit, or function is altered, and indeed if we modify certain elements of manufacturing and other things to a substantial degree, don't ask me what substantial means because it's still being debated, then we may even have to file our regulatory submissions again. So it never ends. But what is it? Let me try to answer that succinctly if I possibly can. So the post-market surveillance process, it includes a systematic, documented set of procedures to capture customer complaints or any kind of harms, even those that rise to the level of a medical device report in the US at least, categorize these issues, track and trend them. And we should do so relative to the number of products we've actually distributed. Because, you could have, say, let's just use an example. 3 products were defective and caused, let's say, minimal patient injury. Unacceptable even at that. Bring this back to the board, and the board says, well, it was only 3. Well, how many did we distribute in that area during that time frame? Right. 5.
Yeah.
5.
It's
okay.
Massive. Yeah.
Huge. So we really have to look at it as a ratio or a percentage. And then we need to be willing and able and demonstrate that we will make changes to the design, the manufacturing, the labeling, et cetera, as needed to mitigate risk that exceeds a given tipping point. And that tipping point must be determined prior to the incident that we're looking at. So we're not going to say at the time of harm, oh, we can tolerate that. No, these things need to be established before they even happen so that everybody's clear that there is an objective milestone or tipping point at which we're going to take certain actions, from the minor to the major. And again, we must have written procedures for gathering the data and proactively doing so, not just waiting for the calls to come in, but actually going out and surveying customers in many cases and more, and determining when those actions should be taken.
Excellent. Okay, so hopefully they have planned for these post-market activities as well, and the collection of data that comes along with that, because they're going to want to not only document the findings, but in some instances, it sounds like further action may be necessary.
Yes.
And so two things come to mind then, because you always, obviously, as you're planning for your launch, you're not necessarily thinking about what could go wrong, right? But things happen, and we know that sometimes things do go wrong. So I'm wondering, so I will be more specific with my questions, but I'm wondering about that. And I'm also wondering how the implementation of cloud-based computing is affecting, if at all, requirements for maintaining these post-market, the integrity of this post-market data.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm so glad you mentioned cloud-based computing, Stacey, because in alignment with the first part of your question about what can go wrong, this is the key area. It's getting a lot of attention, as it should, with regard to data integrity. So we talked a moment ago about how risk management is crucial across the entire product life cycle, right? All the way through to decommissioning and end of shelf life. And it is, by the way, that is actually a specific requirement of the ISO 14971 risk management standard. So we have to link post-market data to our risk management system.
Right.
And how we do that and how we maintain that data, particularly given potentially different networks and platforms and operating systems and so on, in a way that is linked, in a clear way that is linked, where folks on one side of the earth can see what complaints may have come in on the other side of the earth, because it's all part of the same product and we're so global these days. So we really need to look at what can go wrong when we don't have a unified data collection system, and of course, what to do about privacy and integrity and being, designing in adequate security, and forgive me, I'm struggling with the word. I know the concept. I want to say, sort of a redundancy in the system, so that we have some fail safes in place. We even have to consider hackers and other sources and forces that may not have patients' best interests at heart. So really looking at risk mitigation in that system as well. So this is where a cloud-based system can really help. We could essentially have a cloud-based system into which all the crucial feeder systems of customer feedback are linked in real time. And this would give us sort of a centralized place where everybody can easily access the information, and this will allow us to really feed that post-market data back into risk management in the most effective way. We'll know right away or real time if we need to change something on the labeling, if we need to get in touch with the FDA or another regulatory agency, if we need to redesign the device, pull the device back, send a letter to physicians recommending a more frequent diagnostic review, for example, in the case of an implanted device that perhaps we don't want to explant at this point, and so on and so forth. So obviously linking these and linking them in real time with the appropriate security, cybersecurity in place and redundant systems is a huge boon to not only compliance with risk management, but really to the reason why all of us biomedical engineers went into the life sciences instead of being designers for, say, washing machines or irons. No offense, we love those and need those, but it's because we want to do no harm to patients.
Right. And I think you just covered in your response all that I was thinking, not only about the cloud-based computing, but some of the things that can go wrong, particularly after launch, and needing to maybe at times update your design documentation, maybe needing to go back to the FDA and refile some new paperwork or get clarification on different items. Do you have any experience, or when would you know? One of the things we mentioned during the development process, and we kind of said, "Oh, you don't want to have to do a recall," but how, as a manufacturer of a device, would you know if that is necessary? Like, because that seems like an extreme to me, like the last ditch effort to improve on your product is to recall it and start over. So what are your thoughts on that?
You're right. It is a big deal. A couple of thoughts. Well, there's definitely no cookie cutter for this one, as I'm sure you knew when you asked me the question, of course. But I can try to give some boundaries or input around this, if I may.
Yeah.
I believe that the value of our risk management system, up until the time when something goes wrong, the risk management system and the file can seem like, well, it is. It's a tremendous effort, a huge undertaking, requires constant maintenance. It's a big deal. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and focus away from things that maybe engineers would rather be doing. But here's the time. This is the time when we're talking about potential harm to life, when the risk management file is not just there to show the product liability attorneys that we dotted our I's and crossed our T's. No, it's there as a guide. It's a guidepost. It literally gives us, shines, like Carl Sagan used to say, a candle in the darkness. It allows us to find where, as problem solvers and also humans, we engineers, where to begin to investigate, how to decide how bad it is if we do nothing, how to decide how bad it is if we do something, and from every perspective, not only the environment, but all the stakeholders, and of course, especially the patient. So that risk management evaluation, the whole file, it really gives us a starting place that we can really put a stake in the ground and defend. It not only informs our decision, but helps us to defend our decision if it should come to that. So in every way, I think it protects us as professionals. It protects our employers and our good name. And again, most importantly, it protects the patients that we're working for. And I think each of us, I encourage each engineer to do something that I did, and that I know many of my colleagues have done, is to think about a patient with a personal avatar. I always pictured my grandmother. Would I recall this product if it were going to be used on my grandmother? And it kind of cuts through all the profit and all the other, competing issues. And I think that again is a guidepost, and it's part of our risk management consideration.
I love that. And that's the personalization of it. And we as people need to be mindful of other people. And I think that's a great test, a great test in your mind. Like, do I feel like this is safe enough? I mean, and the answer might be that yes, it's perfectly safe. And I definitely would allow my family members to use this. But if you feel uncomfortable, maybe it is time to take a pause and relook at all that you've done, as you mentioned, and defend and defend your choice, defend your decision. So thank you. So I guess it's not a cut and dry, like if you get to X, then Y will happen, and we need to recall. It sounds like it's very a personal, and when I say personal, I mean personal to the company, not as an individual, but a personalized response given the data that you've collected, and the impact that it's had to the consumer. Correct?
Correct, and that it could have to the business as well. Because just one final thought, if I may, to balance that personal point. A medical device manufacturing company cannot help anyone if they're not profitable and if they don't survive.
Right.
So there's a lot to be said for balancing the business concerns with patient concerns.
Fair enough.
Otherwise, we hope nobody's grandmother.
Exactly. No, that is so true. And that is a great point. Sometimes we get really angry over the one-off incidents, and you forget to look at the greater good. So very much appreciated. And Roberta, we have covered so much information in this series. It's amazing. The steps, and really just the thoughtfulness that goes in, and planning that goes into every single step of this process. with that in mind, how would you like listeners to make use of this series, and what resources may exist that might serve as a guideline or a guidepost, as you mentioned, for product commercialization? And of course, any documents that or links or resources that you think are important out there, we will link to in the show notes. But if you can talk a little bit about that in closing, that would be perfect.
Sure. Well, gosh, I think that one way in which I'd love to see this series utilized by our listeners is in colleges and universities with the biomedical engineering graduates or soon to be graduates, perhaps at every level, bachelor's, master's, PhD, so that they're coming out into the industry already with an idea of the broad, not just the details that we learn technically as engineers, but the broader puzzle into which our particular piece fits. So I'd love to see it used for educational purposes proactively before those engineers hit the industry. I'd love to see it shared among manufacturers, large and small, and particularly in the startup community, where maybe not all of these details maybe not everyone has been through all of this.
Right.
Yet.
Right. It is a trial, for sure. You have to have gone through it, I would think, a few times before you start to recognize all of the what ifs and, just the little tiny glitches that can happen along the way.
You're so right. The nuances are they're very subtle, and I think experience is how we come to predict and anticipate, and many times, if we're fortunate, prevent things from going awry.
Absolutely.
We can't just get that from reading the regulatory guidances and standards. And speaking of guidances and standards, you asked me about resources. There's a wealth of resources, great books out there. One of my favorites, of course, this is a recent publication that I was fortunate to co-author and to edit with IVT. Thank you very much, IVT. And it's on all the steps required to bring a medical device from concept to commercialization, including all the details we talked about, process validation, sterilization, the funding, intellectual property, test method validation, design for manufacturability, all of that. And to do it, I brought my actual clients from the industry that I'm so fortunate to have worked with, 17 of the 20 largest global medical device manufacturers. And each client that I requested add their expertise in a chapter based on their experience of the nuances firsthand.
So valuable.
And each of those global device manufacturers contributed something to this handbook. And I think that is available through IVT on the website. Is that right?
It is. It is available. Yes. We have the actual printed copies, and we also have the online version available. So we can link to that for sure in the show notes.
Great. Might be a starting point for everything we said today and more.
Absolutely. Well, Roberta, I thank you so much, not only for the information that you've shared with us, but the time spent in research and developing this podcast series with us at IVT Network. Very, very much appreciated.
It has been my absolute pleasure to talk with you, Stacey, over these 3 weeks. Thank you.
Oh, of course. Thank you again to our guest, Roberta Good. Thank you to our producer, Ed Sullivan, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. And as always, if you love these episodes, please be sure to subscribe in your podcast player of choice. That way they'll pop up there for you every week. And remember to share them with your friends and colleagues, because the more you share, the more information we can get out there. And we do appreciate your help with that. You can find out more about the Voices in Validation podcast, IVT Network, and of course, the Medical Device Handbook at ivtnetwork.com. Another great episode is coming up next week, so we invite you all to join us again for another episode of Voices in Validation. Until then, make it a great week.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.